Well, hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room as usual. I hope you're doing well today. Sunday in Ireland is turning out to be much more beautiful than I had expected, which hopefully will contribute to a sunny mood in addition to sunny climate, sunny weather. Now, before I move on to my topic of the INFJ's TI, let me remind you briefly of these two books. All the links are available down below in the description box. One of the reference books on the INFJ personality, The Ecstatic Soul, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle. So if you're interested in getting those books, have a look at the description box. All the links, they're both less than $10. Okay, so I've made videos before about the INFJ's introverted thinking function. But it seems to me that it's a function that's worth revisiting a little bit, because a lot of my thinking on that front has tended to be speculative and tentative. And in fact, in the chapter of my book, I'm talking about the book on the INFJ called the Open Clearing. So that's chapter 6. That chapter is mostly about unresolved questions or questions requiring further research on the INFJ. So, like, it's a chapter where I list avenues of further research that I consider worthy of being explored. Now, there's sections on the role of the archetypes and explanation of the INFJ personality and behavior, the possibility of modes of existence which are distinct from those that I sketch in this book, alienation, enlightenment, and so on. But there's one on introverted thinking and the child archetype. This is this subsection there that you can see. So in this video, I want to share some thoughts. It's it's kind of riffing on this theme and hopefully providing you with some insights, because I've interacted with a fair number of INFJs over the last few years. And like, my estimate would be, if I'm honest, and this might be considered to be a controversial statement, but I will say it anyway. If you take the total population of INFJs that I've been interacting with, or that I've looked at, their content, their comments, definitely an INFP are the functions that are the most visible. And in some sense, this should not be surprising, given that one is dominant, the other is auxiliary. In fact, you could argue that there'd be more reason, cause to worry if what you saw for the most part was TI. Of course, if what you saw for the most part was TI, you might have reason to believe that the person is mistyped and is really a TI dominant, because after all, outside of observation reports on the evidence that you see, how can you determine someone's type? But you could imagine someone like an INFJ, for example, that shows very little in the way of FE, but you can sense the NI and see all the TI also. So that, to some extent, these types, although they exist, and I would not call them abnormal by any means, it's possible that I belong to that category myself, but at least within the MBTI system, not in other systems necessarily. It's certainly a minority within the broad INFJ population. In other words, either TI is presence, but very much just at the level near the threshold of consciousness. It's doing some work in the background in terms of articulating language, sentences, reasoning, but it's not brought to the forefront, and there's not a lot of reflective ideation on the production of one's thought, which is something that has a lot to do with introverted thinking. Or you see that, but its level of proficiency is, can be improved, assuming the person is intelligent. So, that's my perspective, and it's a judgment. When you make a judgment, you necessarily have to categorize and demarcate. So, in some sense, this video, in addition to exploring the TI of the INFJ, is also meant to maybe give some little bits of advice to INFJs who might be eager to to develop their TI further. First, in the sense of integration, bringing higher at the level of higher consciousness, and also in terms of the proficiency. These two things come together to an extent, but they're a little bit distinct. So I think the first thing that I want to say is that it seems to me that if we look at the evidence of people around us, Jung was right that INFJs having a tertiary function being TI, like any types in relation to their tertiary functions, are not going to be mostly in TI mode. But I think, Jung abstained from making judgments as to proficiency, as to whether TI is used in a way that achieves good results or achieves right results. And I think that he was right to remain agnostic on that front, because he probably wasn't sure, and he might have had assumptions that a higher likelihood of being brought to consciousness means less likelihood of being proficient. But I don't think that the evidence was definitive, and therefore he abstained. I mean, that's my interpretation of it. But there's a couple of things that are important to keep in mind when we think of the INFJ's TI. The first thing is, why is it that a lot of INFJs don't seem to display a lot of TIUs? Okay, and who nevertheless very much come across as INFJs insofar as you can see an INFE. Okay, so an IFE, no question, but you still don't see a lot of TIUs. It's a very widespread phenomenon. I think one of the strong reasons why that's the case is that TIUs, being a function that is tertiary, is a function that is going to be difficult to deploy for a long stretch of time for an INFJ. This theory or this hypothesis is contained in Jung more or less explicitly, more or less implicitly. The idea that your dominant function, you can be kind of in it all the time. You'll never feel psychically tired as a result. Libidinal energy just is channeled and it flows well. With the auxiliary function, it's more or less the same. It takes a bit more libidinal. There's more of a libidinal energy cost to it, but it's still a function that we can use pretty much all the time. When it comes to the more inferior functions, TI, tertiary, and then of course SE inferior, now these functions are, because they're less integrated by definition, because they're less conscious, when we bring them to consciousness and we use them for long periods of time, we have to understand that that means that we are forcing them in some sense to remain conscious for those stretches of time. But the natural inclination, I'm speaking of the functions, is to not remain conscious for that long and to fall back into, sink back into the unconscious, as Jung liked to say. So we're forcing them, and that costs a lot of psychic energy. So it's tiring. So here, my advice as to how to negotiate that is to say, to not be afraid, to not be turned off by the fact that it seems to cause a certain amount of psychic strain when you move into TI mode as an INFJ. It's normal that it causes psychic strain, and it's not necessarily a bad thing that it causes some psychic strain, because what I believe is that you can improve, you can make more room for the amount of energy that you can deploy for TIUs, the more you utilize TI. In other words, the strain becomes less noticeable and less overwhelming over time with more use. So that's not a law whose natural conclusion is that TI will ever become a dominant function for the INFJ, because that will never happen. But you can train yourself, a little bit like training a muscle, to get into TI mode and be able to stretch over time elastically for how long you can be in TI mode without getting to a level of strain where you actually get into unhealthy modes of cognition, or more psychic modes of the psyche, where you might end up being neurotic, you might end up being stressed out, you might end up, I mean, that can happen with TI. It's not just an SE thing, you know, it's correlated with the inferiority of, or the level of consciousness of a function. The more unconscious, the more likely that that strain, if extended for too long, can cause all sorts of psychic modes of unhealth. But you can practice it. Now, my advice would be to practice it with moderation, especially at the beginning, and to always be conscious, to keep an awareness that of the strain as something that it's okay if it's there, but to be aware of when it's becoming hard to focus, especially when you become irritable. When you start to become irritable, it's a very strong sign that you should leave the TI mode and go back to your NI things, right? And NI is a very useful mode here because in some sense you don't have to do anything. If you don't do anything as an INFJ, you're most likely in NI mode because that's the default. And so just don't do anything for a while and you'll replenish your resources. But irritability, a certain tendency to being very defensive and quick to attack, these are the signs of psychic strain that can be caused by extensive mode of TI use. But if you do that with moderation and wisely, well, you can develop your TI. The proficiency comes with practice because, for example, if we take the example of like logical articulation, coherent articulation, or to a large extent, in order to become good at it, you need to practice it, see where you make mistakes, correct those mistakes. Now, while you're doing all of that, you're still very much exploring the different facets of TI. The more you use it, the better your TI becomes. I mean, you can read philosophy books, you can do this and that, but I'm well aware of the fact that most of you probably don't have time or are not willing to invest time in reading philosophical books on, you know, critical thinking or logic or arguments or whatever that might be. Simply the fact of getting into these reflective modes of how your language is constructed, how transparent your categories are, how smooth the inferences are made from one point to the other, what is the excess baggage that doesn't need to be included, aiming for clarity, aiming for precision, aiming for cleanliness of exposition. These are all things that INFJs can be really good at. Even in the INFJs, historical INFJs whose TI was very clear and whose proficiency arguably was a near genius proficiency, you'll notice that in their works where the TI usage is heavy, you can see the trace that is tertiary. You can usually see the trace that is tertiary because it's never books like that are just, like by INFJs anyway, that are full of TI ratiocinations, right? Usually what you see is much more akin to Wittgenstein Tractatus. If you're familiar with the Tractatus by Wittgenstein, it's a series of aphorisms. I mean, it's not just aphorisms. There are aphorisms in it. Series of short paragraphs who are connected in a more or less loose way and progress in that fashion, because it was notoriously difficult for Wittgenstein to get his thoughts out in the open. I think that in many ways you could interpret that as my thoughts insofar as they involve a lot of TI, I can only dispense little by little and I cannot extend the strain for too long a period. So if you keep in mind that even an INFJ like Wittgenstein, in some ways, you know, the greatest INFJ philosopher ever, perhaps with the exception of Plato, you know, if that happens to him, it's going to happen to all of us. So to allow yourself to get into these modes, to not, first of all, to not steer clear of it because you don't think high enough of yourself. And once you've overcome that possible insecurity coming from being a feeler type and so on, to also, you know, allow yourself to not be turned off if you feel like a strong effort is being made, sometimes where the end in sight is not quite clear. Because when you work on the proficiency of a function, it's not necessarily going to be linked to a particular result in the short term. The very fact that you're allowing yourself to be in that mode is going to contribute to increased proficiency and consciousness, obviously as an implied factor in this. And finally, don't forget to get out in the external world. Don't forget to socialize. When you socialize, that's in the Ecstatic Soul as well. When you socialize, you get to engage your SE by necessarily. So you don't need to engage SE in a direct way. You can do it indirectly through socializing and engaging mostly your FE function. When you engage SE in this indirect way, well, you do engage SE, you gather information. Now, the information that you gather is what TI is eventually going to be working with. You don't want it to be always isolated, and for your TI to have only to work with the insight produced by your NI cognition, because the NI cognition is a subjective cognition. It's not a gathering of information. Its activity doesn't consist in a gathering of information in the external world. If you want to have your TI to not dry up and become dysfunctional as a result of not having enough oil, in the mechanism, the oil is the data from the external world. So allow yourself to explore. And if that's not a natural thing for you, because the SE is inferior, engage your FE, other people, the SE information will accrue necessarily. Okay, let me know what you thought in the comments about my little discussion of TI, and I will see you next week, guys. See you soon. Bye.